In the silent heart of Snowbridge Valley, on a night when the snow fell like whispered prayers, a police officer heard a cry in the darkness. Not the cry of a wolf or fox, but something far smaller, far more desperate. What he found beneath the frozen trees would change the entire winter for 3 fragile lives, and for himself. Before we begin, I want to ask you who are watching right now. Where are you joining us from? Let us know in the comments. And if you believe in kindness and in miracles that arrive quietly, please subscribe and support this channel so we can continue bringing stories like this to you. Snowbridge Valley in winter looked almost gentle from a distance, as if the whole town had been tucked beneath a white quilt by a careful hand. But anyone who had lived there long enough knew better. The wind that came rolling down from the mountains was sharp enough to sting through the thickest coat, and the snow could turn a quiet road into a trap in the span of an hour. That night, the sky above the valley was a flat, low gray, smeared with slow-falling snow that softened every edge and swallowed sound. Streetlights along the main road glowed like lonely lanterns in a cathedral of ice, and beyond the last houses, the forest pressed close, dark and patient. It was close to midnight when Ethan Hawthorne guided his patrol SUV along the outer road that traced the tree line. At 47, Ethan had the kind of presence that didn't need flashing lights to be noticed. He was tall, with a broad chest and shoulders shaped by years of wearing a duty belt and body armor, though a faint stiffness in his movements betrayed old injuries and long shifts. His hair, once a solid dark brown, now carried threads of gray at the temples, and a light stubble shadowed his jaw. There was something steady in his face, the quiet seriousness of a man who had seen too many calls that came in as just a welfare check and ended as something people whispered about for years. The lines at the corners of his eyes weren't only from age. They were from nights staring at crime scene tape, from conversations at hospital bedsides, from the time 8 winters ago, when a domestic call in a blizzard had ended with him cradling a little boy who asked where his mother had gone. No one had ever given him a satisfying answer to that question. It had carved something into him, a permanent refusal to dismiss any small cry in the dark. Tonight, the radio was mostly silent, a low murmur of distant chatter. The roads were nearly empty. Most people with any sense were at home, curtains drawn, heaters humming. Ethan drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting near the radio mic, his eyes moving in a practiced rhythm. Mirrors, road, tree line, snowbanks, then back again. He told himself this was just another quiet winter shift, the kind he used to wish for in his early years on the force. But there was a weight in the sky, as if the clouds themselves were holding their breath. It was a small, fragile sound that broke through the muffled hush of the storm. Ethan almost missed it. The SUV's tires hissed over packed snow, the heater fan blew warm air against the windshield, and the forest outside was a lace of black trunks and drifting flakes. He had already driven past the sound when his brain finally decided it hadn't imagined it. He slowed, frowned, and turned down the radio volume. For a moment, there was nothing but the wind. Then he heard it again, so faint he might have believed it belonged to the storm itself. Not the long, haunting howl of a coyote, not the sharp bark of a fox. This was shorter, trembling, breaking halfway through, like a sob too weak to finish. Ethan pulled onto the shoulder, the SUV's tires crunching into the frozen crust at the edge of the road. He let the engine idle and leaned slightly forward, listening. The sound came again, drifting out of the tree line, a small, desperate whine, then a broken, hiccuping cry that made something in his chest tighten. He knew animal sounds well enough. Years of living in Snowbridge Valley had taught him the music of the woods, owls, coyotes, the occasional bobcat. This was wrong, too soft, too pleading. Ethan put the SUV in park and flipped on the rear emergency flashers, red light pulsing weakly against the snow, swirling around the vehicle. He pulled on his hat and gloves, zipped his heavy winter jacket up to his chin, and opened the door. The cold hit him like an open hand across the face, sharp, invasive, insistent. A gust of wind pushed snowflakes against his cheeks as he stepped out, boots crunching on the icy gravel. For a second, he just stood there, letting his ears adjust. The road behind him bent out of sight, empty in both directions. The forest ahead waited, black between the ghost-white trunks of pines and firs. He clicked on his flashlight. the beam slicing a narrow path through the snow. "All right," he muttered under his breath, the way some people spoke to themselves in church pews. "What are you?" He started toward the tree line, scanning the ground as he went. Snow layered thick over the earth, interrupted here and there by the dark spines of low shrubs and the humped shapes of buried rocks. The wind whispered through the branches overhead, shaking loose powder in light showers around him. The cry came again, louder now that he was outside the vehicle, closer. Ethan followed it like a thread, stepping carefully between trees. His boots sank into the drifts, crunching through the crusty top layer. He braced one hand against a trunk to steady himself on a slight slope, the bark cold and rough beneath his glove. The light bobbed ahead of him, catching on branches, lighting up the glitter of ice crystals in the air. He rounded a fallen log, its length iced over, and his beam swung down into a shallow hollow near the base of an old spruce. At first, what he saw didn't quite register, just a dark bundle pressed against the side of the tree, half buried in snow, shaking. He took 2 more steps, his breath fogging in front of him, and the shape resolved into something heartbreakingly small. A German Shepherd puppy lay there, huddled in on itself, paws wrapped around a faded cloth bag as if it were clinging to another body. The pup looked to be 7, maybe 8 weeks old enough that its ears were beginning to stand, though one still tipped over at the end, giving its face a lopsided, fragile innocence. Its fur was a classic sable pattern, the dark saddle across its back dusted white with snow, the tan on its legs, and muzzle dulled by cold and dirt. Ice clung in tiny beads to the whiskers around its snout. Its body shook with violent shivers that made its paws twitch against the bag. Ethan's first automatic assessment ran through his mind like a checklist. Small, underweight, borderline hypothermic from the way it was trembling. Respiration shallow but present. No obvious blood on the fur. But the clinical part of his brain was quickly overrun by something far simpler and older. An ache. The puppy lifted its head as his flashlight beam settled, its eyes reflecting the light in a glassy, wet shimmer. They were not the wild, alert eyes of a feral animal, ready to bolt or attack. They were wide and dark, filled with a confusion that bordered on despair, like it had already tried crying and found the world slow to answer. A weak whimper slipped out of its throat, half sob, half plea. The bag it clutched was an old canvas thing, stained and worn, with one frayed strap trailing in the snow. Ethan couldn't see what was inside. The cloth was gathered and bunched under the puppy's paws, pressed tight against its chest. Whatever it held, the pup had decided it was worth guarding with the last of its strength. Ethan crouched slowly, feeling his knees protest under the strain and the cold. He lowered the flashlight beam so it wasn't shining directly into the puppy's eyes and kept his movements deliberate, calm, the way he'd once been trained to approach injured animals or frightened children. His breath clouded the air between them, and he watched the pup flinch at the small gust of warmth, as if heat itself had become a surprise. "Hey there, buddy," he said quietly, his voice low and even. In moments like this, Ethan's usual reserve softened. He was not the stern figure who stood in courtrooms or at the front of briefing rooms. He became the man who had once sat on a curb for 40 minutes with a runaway teenager, sharing lukewarm cocoa from a gas station cup until she stopped shaking enough to talk. There was a gentleness in him that he rarely advertised, but it surfaced around fragile things. "You picked a hell of a night to be out here." The puppy stared at him, breathing fast, its ribs fluttering beneath the thin fur. It didn't growl. It didn't snap. It didn't even try to drag the bag away. It simply held on, the way a drowning person might hold on to a piece of driftwood. Ethan slowly extended one gloved hand, fingers relaxed, palm facing slightly upward. The pup's nose twitched. Cautious, shaking, it leaned forward a fraction of an inch, then another, as if each movement cost it more of the little heat it had left. Its nose touched the glove. For a second, they were both still. A middle-aged officer with snow in his hair and tired joints, and a half-frozen puppy clinging to an old cloth bag as if it held the last bit of its world. The pup inhaled. Ethan knew what it would smell. Leather, wool, traces of coffee, a hint of dog from the K-9 unit he sometimes trained with. The human scent underneath it all, a mix of fatigue, stress, and something that, to an animal, translated simply as familiar. Not the scent of the one who had left it here, but not the scent of danger either. The puppy made a sound then, something halfway between a sigh and a sob. Its paws loosened just a fraction around the bag, just enough that Ethan could see the cloth shift, sagging as if there were weight inside. The discovery pressed against his awareness, but he didn't rush it. There would be time, seconds, minutes, to find out what the bag contained. Right now, survival came first. "It's okay," he whispered, more to the night than to the animal. His voice felt small in the enormous hush of the forest. "You're not alone out here anymore." Snow continued to fall around them, gathering silently on the brim of his hat and the pup's trembling back. Somewhere behind him, unseen but waiting, his SUV stood on the roadside like a bright square of safety in the dark. Ethan stayed there for another long moment, hand outstretched, letting the puppy decide. Little by little, as if surrendering to a tide it could no longer fight, the puppy shifted its weight. It didn't abandon the bag, but it inched closer to his hand, close enough that he could feel the frantic, fluttering warmth of its breath against his glove. The bag remained clutched to its chest, a small, mysterious bundle pressed against its heart. Ethan's gaze moved from the animal's desperate eyes to the stained canvas it refused to release, and he felt an unease coil in his stomach. Whatever was inside that bag, it mattered to this tiny creature enough for it to fight the winter with its body alone. He didn't know yet what he had truly found on the edge of the forest that night. All he knew was that something very small was trying very hard not to die, and that he had arrived just in time to hear its cry. The forest always felt larger at night, as if every branch and hollow expanded in the darkness. Ethan remained crouched beside the puppy for several long seconds, the cold biting deeper into his legs. Now that the small creature had accepted his presence, he reached slowly toward his radio and pressed the button. "Dispatch, this is Hawthorne," he murmured, keeping his voice low so as not to startle the pup. "I've got a found animal, possible distress situation. I'll be transporting. Keep the line open." A soft acknowledgement crackled back to him. He ended the transmission and returned his focus to the trembling pup. With great care, he slid an arm beneath its chest and lifted gently. The puppy tensed, but didn't fight. Its paws remained clamped around the cloth bag until Ethan brought it up with both arms, pup and bag together, cradling them like fragile porcelain. Under his gloves, he could feel how little heat the puppy had left. "Easy, I've got you," he whispered. The walk back to the SUV felt strangely long. Snow pressed against the tops of his boots, and the wind whipped around the trees as though trying to chase him off. By the time he reached the vehicle, the puppy's head was tucked under his chin, not for affection, but for warmth. Ethan opened the back door and placed the pup carefully on the seat. He reached into the emergency kit, pulled out a thermal blanket, and wrapped it securely around the tiny body. The puppy whimpered at the sudden change in environment, car, lights, fabric, but then stilled as the blanket trapped what little warmth it had, plus the steady heat of the SUV's cabin. Its nose peeked out like a shy ember under ash. Only then did Ethan allow himself the chance to examine the ground near the tree line once more. He stepped back outside, flashlight sweeping wide arcs across the snow. Now that he wasn't distracted by the struggle to save a freezing animal, he saw more, and what he saw made him straighten slowly, muscles tightening. There were tracks, a clear set of human footprints leading into the woods, but not leading out. They were large, adult-sized boots, and the stride length suggested someone walking briskly, not stumbling. Near the base of a tree was a smear of something darker. Ethan moved closer and crouched again. His fingers brushed the snow. The stain was faint, drying, not fresh, but unmistakable. Blood. Just a small smear, maybe a drop or two brushed off a glove or boot, but blood all the same. The footprints continued past the spot for another 10 meters before stopping at a churned patch of snow, where tire tracks cut across. A vehicle had been here, a small one by the width of the tracks. A light-duty pickup. Ethan traced the direction visually. The truck had backed in, paused, then pulled forward and returned to the road. He exhaled slowly, a mist of white vapor curling away from his lips. It looked like someone had carried something. Or someone, into the woods, stayed a moment, and then driven away. That was bad. A fox might abandon prey, a mother wolf might leave a weak pup, but a human didn't leave a 7-week-old German Shepherd puppy in sub-zero conditions by accident. Certainly not one clutching a canvas bag. Ethan followed the tracks back to his SUV, his mind turning like a mill grinding slowly over stones. He slid into the driver's seat and shut the door behind him, letting the warmth rush up to meet his numbed face. The puppy was watching him. Its eyes, dark as ink wells, met his. The bag still pressed against its chest under the blanket. Ethan reached a hand toward it again, palm up. This time, instead of trembles of fear, the pup leaned its head into his fingers. A tentative trust. He allowed himself the smallest smile. Then he touched the edge of the canvas bag. "Let's see what you've been holding on to," he murmured. He eased the fabric open just enough to look inside, and there, huddled and silent, were two smaller shapes. Two tiny German Shepherd newborns, maybe 10 days old at most. Their eyes not yet open, bodies scarcely covered in thin fuzz. They were curled together like two fragile kernels of warmth. Ethan inhaled sharply. The pup who had survived the cold had been trying to warm them. A baby caring for babies. His throat tightened. "All right," he whispered. "Now I get it." He reached for the engine start button and turned up the heater. Warm air surged into the cabin. He ensured the pups were wrapped securely in the blanket, creating a cocoon of protection around all three. He picked up the radio again. "Dispatch Hawthorne. I need animal rescue personnel at the station. Emergency care required. Hypothermic neonate canines. One juvenile in distress." The dispatcher's voice sharpened. "Copy that, Hawthorne. Grace is on call tonight. We'll notify her." Grace Ellington. Even the name made something in Ethan's tone ease. Grace was 32, sharp-eyed, small-framed, nimble-fingered. She had the agility of someone who spent more time kneeling beside injured animals than standing at desks. Her hair was a warm, honey blonde, usually tied back in a ponytail, and she spoke with an instinctive tenderness, tempered by a fierce competence. She had grown up with horses, volunteered at shelters, and once nursed a wounded coyote pup back to health. Where Ethan embodied steady, sober endurance, Grace embodied warmth and gentle precision. She was exactly who he needed, waiting when he arrived. Ethan gently shifted the blanket to check the newborns. No movement at first, then a faint twitch. The bigger of the two gave a tiny, soundless wiggle of its paws. That was enough. It was alive. The older pup, the protector, rested its head near them, ears drooping. "You kept them alive," Ethan murmured. "That's more than a lot of grown adults would have managed." The drive back to the road felt slower than before, though Ethan steered steadily. Each bump or turn was taken gently, as if the SUV carried China in the back seat. He wasn't just driving victims to safety. He was escorting something sacred. Snowbridge Valley's lights appeared faintly through the storm, glowing like scattered candles in the dark. Houses lined the edges of the main road, curtains drawn, families warm, unaware of the little miracles moving toward them in the back of a marked patrol vehicle. At a red light, Ethan glanced back. The pup had stretched slightly, nose touching one of the newborns. The movement looked instinctual, ancient, older than human memory, maybe older than winter itself. When the SUV rolled into the police lot, Grace was already there, waiting under the canopy of the station entrance, her breath fogging around her face as she clutched a portable heater and a small crate layered with fleece. Her eyes widened when she saw the bundle in Ethan's arms. He approached, carefully transferring responsibility into her waiting hands. Grace's voice dropped to a whisper. "You poor little things." She didn't ask Ethan how he found them. She didn't ask what had happened. The questions would come, but not yet. Now was the time to save life, not analyze it. Together, they moved inside, to warmth, light, and hope. And as soon as the door shut behind them, the forest outside seemed to breathe out the last remnant of its secret. Snowbridge Valley's police station wasn't a large building. It sat near the center of town, like a sturdy block of brick and frosted glass, with a wooden overhang that creaked in the wind. Inside, the night shift lights glowed softly, not harsh like fluorescent office lights, but yellowed and warm, more like an old kitchen lamp that had seen decades of winter nights. Grace Ellington walked quickly through the main hallway, her boots leaving small wet prints on the tiled floor. Most people saw Grace and thought she was delicate. She was of medium height, slender, and moved quietly. But anyone who knew her understood better. She had a kind of unshakable calm, like a lantern inside a storm, steady always. She had grown up on a small rural property outside of town, surrounded by animals her entire childhood. Dogs, horses, barn cats, even the occasional injured deer her father would tend to when hunters found one hurt. She had learned early that gentleness could carry immense strength. At 32, Grace had warm hazel eyes that always seemed to be looking into a creature more than at it. Her hair, a honey blonde shade, was pulled back loosely in a ponytail, with strands escaping to frame her face. Her personality was the kind that drew in anxious animals and anxious people alike, comforting, intuitive, patient. But she also had a stubbornness when it came to protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. There had been a case 4 years earlier, an injured police K9 named Arrow, and the way that dog had whimpered in pain while still trying to follow commands had broken something inside Grace. Since then, she had made it almost a personal mission to soften this world where animals too often paid for human choices. Ethan stepped inside carrying the bundle. Grace immediately came forward, her voice low, controlled. "Where are they?" Ethan nodded toward the blanket in his arms. Grace lifted one corner gently, and her expression softened, not with surprise, not with pity, but with empathy. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered to the older pup. "You've been trying so hard, haven't you?" The puppy opened his eyes, dull with exhaustion, but relaxed as if even the sound of her voice warmed him. Together they moved quickly into the secondary room, technically a storage area, unofficially repurposed as animal rescue space. It held rolling carts with heating pads, blankets, basic medical supplies, and some donated items like tiny sweaters and feeding syringes. Grace had set up a small, portable incubator-like space, a padded crate with a heating unit beneath it, ready for the newborns. Ethan carefully transferred the older pup first, laying him in a soft bed. The pup instinctively turned his head toward the bag, panic stirring. His paws weakly reached toward it. Grace noticed and murmured, "We're not taking them from you, little one. We're just making them warm." She opened the bag. Ethan held his breath. The 2 newborns were still there, still alive, their bodies pressed against each other. Their tiny chests barely moved. Grace wore no gloves now. She took the newborns with careful hands, the kind used to cradle fragile things, and placed them into the warmed crate, adjusting the blankets around them like tucking in an infant. One of the newborns gave a faint twitch and a tiny squeak, a sound so small it might have been mistaken for a hiccup. "Good," Grace whispered. "Good sign." She reached into her kit and took out 2 small fingertip-sized heating pads, warmed through a chemical reaction. She placed them near, not on, the pups, providing gentle warmth without shock. Meanwhile, Ethan stroked the head of the older pup, who was lying on the other heated bed. Rocco, though he did not know his name, lifted his muzzle and pressed it against Ethan's palm in a gesture of quiet desperation. Ethan swallowed and spoke softly. "I know. They're still close. They're safe." For a few minutes there was silence, except for faint breathing and the hum of the heating unit. Then Ethan spoke. "There were footprints," he said. "Human, one adult, and blood. Just a touch of it." Grace didn't look away from the newborns. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "How old?" she asked. "The stain wasn't fresh," Ethan replied, "but recent enough to be from tonight." She nodded slowly. "Someone carried them in, someone stopped there, and someone left them." There was no anger in her voice, just deep, solemn disappointment. She reached for the older pup and examined his paws, ears, skin. "He's dehydrated," she murmured. "Mild frostbite on the paw tips, but he's resilient. He held out long enough for you to find him." Ethan exhaled. "He's a survivor." "No," Grace said, shaking her head gently. "He's a protector. That's different." She didn't say the rest aloud. Protectors often end up paying heavily for loyalty. Somewhere down the hall, the dispatcher shuffled papers. A coffee machine clicked. A heater hummed. But inside the rescue room, time seemed to curl around these small beings. Grace continued working, checking the neonate's body temperature, massaging tiny legs, stimulating circulation. She hummed under her breath, not a song exactly, but a soothing monotone vibration, like one the pups would have felt from their mother's chest. After a while, Ethan asked the question quietly. "Do you think the mother is alive?" Grace's hands paused only for a moment. "There was blood on the tree," Ethan added, "and someone brought the pups there, which could mean the mother was injured." Grace considered. If she was wounded and taken, maybe stolen, these pups may have been abandoned as not worth keeping, too small to sell or raise. There was a cold brutality in that logic. Ethan frowned, jaw tightening. "I hate that you're probably right." Grace glanced at him. "The important thing is, they're here now. They're alive. We start from that." For a while, Ethan simply watched her work. She had a way of pouring focus into her hands, of letting her heart move through them. After maybe 40 minutes, when warmth had finally returned to the puppies, Grace sat back and let out a long, slow breath. "They'll need bottle feeding every 2 hours," she said. "Round the clock." "I'll take a shift," Ethan offered immediately. Grace raised an eyebrow. "You, bottle feeding neonates?" "I'm coachable," he said with a faint smile. She let out a soft chuckle, not outright laughter, but the kind that slipped like thawing ice from the edge of her voice. "I'll take you up on that." Ethan looked again at Rocco, the older pup. The blanket wrapped him snugly, and his eyes were slowly closing as warmth and fatigue overcame fear. "He'll be okay?" Ethan asked. Grace looked at him fondly. "With rest, fluids, and time, yes, he'll be okay." The storm outside battered against the windows, as if Snowbridge Valley itself was testing the walls. But inside, there was warmth and breath and life. Finally, as the clock crept toward 2 a.m., Ethan rose. "I'll file the report," he said. "Prints, blood, vehicle. Maybe we can match something." Grace nodded. "The sooner we find who did this, the better." Ethan paused at the doorway. His eyes traveled one last time to the crate of newborns, to the older pup guarding them with his gaze, to Grace kneeling beside them like a silent guardian. There was tragedy here, but there was also hope. And as he stepped into the hallway, Ethan felt something unexpected, something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose. The world inside the rescue room was quiet, almost reverent, as if the walls themselves had agreed to speak softly out of respect for the tiny beings now entrusted to them. The heating unit in the crate glowed faintly beneath the blankets, creating a warmth that was almost womb-like. Grace sat close, legs folded beneath her, leaning over the newborn pups, with a concentration that bordered on prayer. Ethan returned after filing preliminary notes, fingerprint smudges on his jacket from the keyboard, and a slight stiffness in his shoulders. But the moment he stepped into the room and saw the 3 small shapes, 2 in the warming crate, 1 wrapped separately, something inside him softened again. Grace looked up at him. "They're stabilizing," she said. "Body temperature is rising. Heartbeats are stronger." Ethan moved closer, his eyes widening at the sight of the newborns. They looked impossibly small, their bodies barely longer than his palm, even at full stretch. Their eyelids were still sealed, tiny snouts wrinkling as they breathed. Their ears, folded against their skulls, made them resemble fragile woodland creatures rather than the sturdy, sharp-eared shepherds they would become. Ethan couldn't help but marvel. "Only 10 days old, maybe less." Grace nodded. "They're at the earliest stage. They can't see, they can't hear, they can't regulate their body temperature." She spoke matter-of-factly, but not coldly. She spoke like someone stating the terms of a sacred contract. She reached in and gently lifted one of the newborns, her hand supporting its entire underside. The pup's tiny limbs flexed weakly, more reflex than movement. Grace brought the pup closer to her chest to keep it warm while she examined it. "This one is male," she said softly. "Smaller than average, probably runty but fighty." She smiled faintly. "And this one," she gestured to the other newborn still in the blanket. "Female, a little stronger. Her breathing is steadier." Ethan leaned down, studying them with deep attention. The newborn smelled faintly of milk and wool, and something innocent that tugged at him with unexpected force. Grace placed the male pup back gently. They'll need bottle feeding soon. They won't latch instinctively, not without their mother, but will mimic stimulation until they recognize the feeding motion. Her hands moved with efficiency, opening tiny feeding bottles, filling them with warmed formula, testing the temperature on her wrist. Ethan found himself remembering something he hadn't thought of in years. His older sister bottle-feeding orphaned kittens on their childhood porch, the way small lives clung to nourishment the moment they found it. Grace finished preparing the feeding supplies and looked up. "Do you want to help?" she asked. Ethan blinked. "Me?" She smiled. "Yes. No one is born knowing how. We learn." Ethan swallowed and nodded. Grace passed him a newborn, wrapped in a tiny corner of blanket, and one of the miniature bottles. Ethan held the pup carefully, supporting its head and back like a newborn baby. Grace guided him. "Angle the bottle, not horizontal, slanted downwards so they don't aspirate." "Good." Ethan steadied his grip. The pup's tiny mouth found the rubber tip, hesitated, then latched with remarkable hunger. A faint rhythm of sucking began, each pull small but determined. Ethan's eyebrows rose. "He's actually doing it." Grace grinned. "Yes, they come into this world wanting to live." A pause. "Some just need help." A few feet away, the older pup, Rocco, watched as best he could, head lifting weakly. His body was still curled, absorbing heat, but his gaze tracked the newborns with solemn attention. As Ethan fed the tiny pup, Grace observed Rocco thoughtfully. She reached out and stroked his head as she spoke quietly. "Look at him. He's barely 2 months old, and yet he took responsibility like a guardian. He didn't leave them. He didn't run. He stayed and tried to keep them warm with his own body." Ethan nodded. "A baby dog trying to be a mother." Grace looked at him with a hint of sadness. Because whoever should have been their protector wasn't. For a while they worked in silence. The newborns fed, just a few milliliters each, then curled into the warmed blankets again, their small bellies fuller. The male pup twitched in sleep, his first real rest since the crisis in the woods. Once they were settled, Ethan exhaled and rubbed the back of his neck. "We need to identify who abandoned them." Grace looked toward the heating crate. "And why?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "I saw enough to know it wasn't an accident." Grace nodded. "I've seen cases, puppy mills, illegal breeding, smuggling, but this feels personal." "How?" Grace hesitated. "Because she nodded toward Rocco, was meant to be kept alive long enough to guard the others. It suggests someone thought about survival, even minimally. They didn't just throw the pups away. They left them in a place where they might be found, if someone listened." Ethan considered that. So maybe the person wasn't cruel. Maybe they were desperate. Grace didn't disagree. The storm outside raged harder. The windows rattled as the wind howled, and snow streaked past in long diagonal lines. But inside, the heat radiated softly, cocooning them all. At one point, Rocco made a small sound, a half whine, half chirp. Grace rose and moved to him. "Let's get you hydrated." She prepared a small dish of electrolytes and water, coaxing him to sip. The pup weakly licked at the fluid, then more eagerly. Ethan knelt beside him. "You're safe now, buddy. We won't leave you." Rocco responded by resting his head against Ethan's arm. After nearly an hour more of care, heat, feeding, gentle monitoring, the 3 pups lay curled and stable, drifting into deep sleep. Grace leaned back against the wall, stretching her aching shoulders. Ethan sat beside her, mirror posture. "We'll keep them here tonight," Grace said. "Tomorrow morning, I'll transfer them to the center properly. If they continue stabilizing, the next 48 hours will be critical, but manageable." Ethan nodded. "You'll call me with updates?" Grace smiled tiredly. "I'll call you even if you don't ask. I know you're invested now." Ethan smiled awkwardly, almost sheepishly, but didn't deny it. When he finally rose to leave, the room felt like a nest. Small sighs of sleeping pups. Soft heat. He turned back once before opening the door. 3 small lives that had nearly frozen to death now slept in warmth. And though he didn't know it yet, this night was not just a rescue. It was the beginning of something that would anchor itself in his life for a long time. The storm did not rest as night deepened. It roared through Snowbridge Valley in heavy gusts, shaking roofs and rattling window panes like a warning from ancient winter spirits. Plows moved down the main road in slow lines, pushing waves of snow aside. But beyond the lit streets, behind the police station and its quiet brick walls, the world was brittle and dangerous. The cold outside could kill in minutes. Inside the small rescue room, Grace wrapped the newborn pups in layers of soft cloth, warmed by the portable heater beneath. Their tiny bodies, no larger than closed hands, twitched as they struggled with the new sensations: heat, safety, softness. For creatures born into cold abandonment, warmth itself was unfamiliar. Rocco, curled in his own heated bed, remained awake longer than expected. His eyes followed Grace's movements, then Ethan's, then returned to the crate that held the newborns. There was an instinct in him, ancient, unspoken, built into the memory of wolves, that would not dismiss the existence of smaller life. At around 3 a.m., the feeding began again. Grace leaned over the pups with practiced care, pumping formula into tiny bottles. "They need feeding every 2 hours," she said. "Their blood sugar is dangerously low. If we slip even a little—" "We won't," Ethan replied firmly. Grace raised a brow with a faint smile. "Officer Hawthorne, doing midnight infant feeding duty." He smirked. "Don't underestimate me. I've handled drunk suspects at 3 a.m., crying toddlers lost at carnivals, and one panicked woman birthing twins in the back of a minivan." Grace blinked. "I'm sorry. What?" Ethan shrugged casually. "Long story. Messy story." Grace shook her head, smiling softly. "Maybe one night when these little ones are grown, you'll tell me." The newborn stirred. The female, slightly larger, began squirming first. The male followed weakly, twitching his snout in search of sustenance. Grace gently lifted the female, cupping her with one hand, bottle with the other. Ethan took the male again. He held the pup with a gentleness uncharacteristic of a man who often cuffed criminals and trained at shooting ranges. The male pup latched onto the bottle with surprising determination. "He's stronger," Ethan whispered. Grace nodded. "They both are. They're responding." Minutes passed. The pups fed, their bodies slowly warming from the inside. And then Rocco, still on his bed, gave a faint cry. Not a bark, not a whine. Something between a plea and a question. Ethan turned to him. "You want to be closer?" he murmured. He lifted Rocco, still wrapped, and brought him nearer to the crate. Rocco leaned forward immediately, pressing his nose against the heating surface, face oriented toward the newborns. His body relaxed visibly. He did not need to touch them, just to sense them. "He's calmer now," Grace observed. "Because they're near," Ethan replied. Grace looked at him thoughtfully. He was freezing out there, and instead of burrowing into some dry spot under a tree, he curled around the bag. He chose instinct over self. "And now," Ethan added softly, "he's letting us take over." They fell silent again. For a long moment, the room was filled with nothing but small breaths, soft hums of electronics, and the distant howl of the storm outside. Then Grace rose. "Heat is stable. I'm going to prepare the vehicle for transport." Ethan frowned. "At this hour?" "Yes. The snow's actually calmer right now, the break between gust patterns." She checked her watch. "If we leave in the next 15 minutes, we can get them to the dedicated animal care center while roads are plowed." Ethan nodded. "I'll drive," he said. Grace looked up. "Are you sure?" "I'm the one with a 4-wheel drive SUV and snow tires." He paused. "And I'm not leaving them." Grace didn't argue. Together they began preparation. Grace gently lifted the crate of newborns, now warmed and fed. Ethan carried Rocco. The pup had finally begun to drift into half-sleep, eyes slow to close, but no longer darting in anxiety. As the station doors opened, cold air burst inward like a jealous ghost of the storm. Ethan sheltered Rocco's head against his chest. Grace shielded the crate with her body. Snow crunched underfoot as they crossed to the SUV. Inside, Ethan started the engine. Heat surged through the vents. Grace placed the crate on the rear seat and secured it with straps. Ethan set Rocco beside it and placed another warmed blanket partly covering both. The older pup let out a soft sigh. Grace watched him. He trusts you? Ethan shook his head slightly. He trusts anyone that isn't the person who abandoned him. Grace tightened her jaw. We're definitely finding out who did that. Ethan didn't disagree. They started driving. Snowbridge Valley passed by, houses blanketed, trees sagging with frozen weight, street lamps glowing like solitary beacons in swirling white. Inside the SUV, it was warm, quiet. Grace looked back at the dogs every few seconds. You know, she said softly, people always think being a rescuer is mostly medical skill or technique. But it's not. It's patience. It's empathy. Animals don't care if you're certified. They care if you're kind. Ethan nodded. Makes sense, Grace continued. I used to think you had to earn their trust, but sometimes they just give it, because they want to believe someone will care. She glanced at Rocco. And sometimes they're brave enough to trust twice. Ethan reflected on that statement. The newborns slept quietly, their small chests rising and falling in steady rhythm. Warmth enveloped them, carried softly between their siblings and the humming heater. Then the SUV hit a patch of rough snow. The rear wheels jostled slightly. Grace leaned over quickly, steadying the crate. You okay? Ethan asked. Fine. The pups barely moved. Ethan drove carefully, each turn slow and deliberate. For the rest of the drive, they spoke only in low tones, about feeding schedules, emergency procedures, and how soon the pups might open their eyes. Eventually, the animal center appeared, dimly lit but functioning, its doors unlocked for nighttime intake emergencies. Once inside, the newborns were transferred to a veterinary incubator with controlled humidity and temperature. Rocco was given his own enclosure nearby, lined with heated bedding and a shallow water dish. Grace filled out intake forms. Ethan hovered nearby, watching Rocco settle in. Look at him, Grace murmured. He finally looks safe. Ethan felt something heavy in his chest finally ease. When they were done, Ethan stood by Rocco's enclosure. He whispered, Rest up, little guy. We'll be back. Rocco's eyes fluttered open briefly. He didn't whine. He didn't try to reach the newborns. He just looked at Ethan. And in that gaze, a silent agreement. Ethan straightened. Grace met his eyes across the room. We saved them tonight, she said. Ethan nodded. That's just the beginning. The animal care center had always been a functional place. Sterile floors, white walls, cabinets full of supplies. But in the weeks that followed, it transformed into something deeper, almost homelike, because of the presence of 3 dogs who had survived a winter's trial. The newborns, now waking with eyes open and small ears lifting, had become daily miracles to everyone who passed their incubator unit. And Rocco, once shivering and gaunt, now walked slowly but steadily in his enclosure, body filling out, fur recovering its sheen under steady warmth and nutrition. Ethan Hawthorne began visiting almost every day. At first, he came in uniform, stepping in during shifts, smelling faintly of snow and asphalt and cold night air. But soon his visits shifted to off-duty visits. He would arrive in plain winter clothes, a heavy wool sweater, a practical parka, snow-worn boots, and always with something in hand. Sometimes it was formula for the newborns. Sometimes it was plush dog toys. Sometimes it was blankets. Sometimes it was nothing except his presence, quiet, calm, kind. The staff would nod to him as he entered. Oh, the policeman's here again, they would murmur, half amused, half touched. He would go first to the incubator. The newborns, still too small to walk steadily, would lift their heads and sniff. Their tiny tails, thin like paintbrush tips, would wiggle with recognition, though they did not yet fully understand why. Ethan would lower his voice and speak to them softly, almost reverently, as if addressing tiny children. There you go. Look at you. You're stronger today. Your sister's eyes are finally open. Good boys. Good girl. Then he would turn to Rocco. Rocco, the pup who had held on through the cold, who had fought to keep his siblings alive, would greet him with tail thumps and small grunts of affection. His body had changed drastically in 3 weeks. No longer skeletal, no longer hollow-eyed. Now he stood with the beginnings of proper German shepherd posture, back straighter, head lifted, paws firmer on the floor. His fur had thickened, dark saddle marking clearer, tan coat warmer. He was still young, but carried a gravity beyond age. Grace often watched those visits from the hallway or from behind the counter. She noticed that Ethan never rushed his time with Rocco. He sat down. He let Rocco come to him. If Rocco nuzzled into his hand quietly, Ethan accepted it silently. If Rocco lay down beside him, Ethan sat there until the dog slept. One evening, after a particularly long visit, Grace approached Ethan as he stroked Rocco's ears. "You know," she said, "if you spend any more time here, he's going to start thinking you work at this shelter." Ethan smirked faintly. "Maybe I do." Grace tilted her head. "I've been thinking about adoption." He looked up. "Temporary at first," she clarified. "A foster arrangement. Rocco is at the age where bonding is critical. If he has a stable human presence, someone he trusts, it will help his emotional development and his sense of safety." Ethan looked down at the pup. Rocco was sitting with quiet dignity, but his gaze was gentle, hopeful. "Yes," Ethan said. "I'll do it." Grace didn't seem surprised. "Paperwork takes a few days, but I'll start initiating the process." 3 days later, he signed temporary fostering paperwork. The newborns, however, remained in the center. They needed time, constant care, round-the-clock feeding. Their eyes were fully open now. Their legs wobbled like tiny stilts. Their fluffy ears had begun to stand halfway, like crooked flags. Volunteers adored them. One named them temporarily, just little placeholder nicknames, but the names didn't quite stick. They were simply the babies. Meanwhile, Rocco entered Ethan's home. It was a modest house at the edge of Snowbridge Valley. 2 bedrooms, creaking floorboards, windows overlooking a yard now buried in white. Ethan had already prepared for Rocco's arrival. A padded bed near the fireplace, stainless steel bowls, chew toys, a blanket that smelled like the police station, which strangely comforted the dog. The moment Rocco walked inside, he paused, and Ethan watched something almost sacred unfold. The pup sniffed the air, he sniffed the floor, he sniffed the bed, he sniffed Ethan's boots, and then he sat, not in confusion, but in quiet acceptance, as if declaring, "This is home." Ethan knelt beside him. "That's right, buddy. You're safe here." Rocco reached forward and licked his hand. The days that followed were peaceful. Ethan would wake early, shovel snow, make coffee, and Rocco would follow him from room to room, paws pattering softly, tail wagging with calm loyalty. On work days, Ethan arranged with Grace to leave Rocco for daytime care at the center until he could finalize trust in leaving him at home alone. The newborns continued to grow, gaining weight, growing fuzz into real fur, developing personalities, and Ethan visited them too, every day. Once, when he lifted the smaller male pup, that tiny creature pressed its face against his palm, remembering perhaps the warmth that had saved it. Grace saw it and smiled. "They remember touch," she said. "Scent, warmth. These things stay." Winter deepened outside, temperatures dropping, storms passing in waves. But inside human-made shelters, the 3 pups thrived under constant attention. As the 60th day arrived, Grace walked into the entrance of the center holding a folder. She found Ethan sitting beside Rocco's enclosure, hand resting on the pup's back. She approached quietly and spoke gently. "Ethan, it's official." He turned. "You've been approved for permanent adoption." Ethan looked at her, then looked at Rocco, then exhaled, slowly, deeply, like a man finally releasing a long-carried burden. Rocco seemed to understand. His ears perked fully for the first time, and he nudged Ethan's hand insistently. Ethan laughed under his breath. "All right," he murmured. "All right, boy. I'm not letting you go." That evening, Ethan returned home, Rocco riding calmly in the back seat. Snowbridge Valley was blanketed in soft, heavy snow. Christmas lights flickered on quiet houses. Smoke rose from chimneys like prayer threads. Inside the warm house, Rocco lay on his bed near the fire. Ethan sat beside him, reading, though not truly reading, just enjoying the shared silence. Sometimes Rocco would look up at him. Sometimes Ethan would look back, and in that exchange, something unspoken and eternal passed between them. He was no longer a frightened bundle of fur in the snow. He was family, not a hero who understood everything, not a symbol of loyalty and sacrifice. just a small creature who had chosen the kindness of humans over the loneliness of the forest, and had found, at last, a place to belong. In the quiet closing of this story, we are reminded that God's miracles do not always arrive with thunder or bright signs. Sometimes they come through a loyal dog who refuses to give up, through a man who chooses compassion over convenience, and through the strength God places in ordinary people when they feel they have nothing left. In our everyday lives, we face storms too, moments when we feel tired, uncertain, or alone. But God walks beside us even then. He guides our steps, protects our families, and sends help in ways we often recognize only afterward. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need encouragement today. Leave a comment to tell us your thoughts, and type Amen if you believe in the quiet miracles God still works. Do not forget to click subscribe to support this channel so we can continue sharing stories of faith, hope, and love. May God bless you and your loved ones with peace, protection, and strength.